Welcome back to Fan Rolls with me tonight, your host, Martin Daubry. Now, here was the moment earlier on this week that Reform MP Sarah Pochin caused something of a storm in the House of Commons because of her question about Sharia law.
Does the new Secretary of State for Justice recognise Sharia law and Sharia courts in the United Kingdom? Yes or no?
Sharia law forms no part of the law of England and Wales, but in common with Christian, Jewish and other courts of faith where people choose to put themselves before those councils, that's part of the religious tolerance that is an important British value.
Well, it's not the first time that she's caused something of a stir in the chamber, and I'm joined now by Reform MP herself, Sarah Pochin. Sarah Pochin, welcome to the show. So the last time you mentioned about the burqa ban, now Sharia law. There are 85, I believe, open Sharia courts throughout the UK. Why do you think we need to get rid of them?
Look, Martin, I raised this question, I think quite rightly, to the new Secretary of State for Justice, David Lammy, and his Minister, Sarah Sackman, answered, but basically answered saying that the government would tolerate Sharia courts. I raised this question because, as you know, I am a champion for women's rights, and I speak at every opportunity against the suppression of women. Now, Sharia courts that we know are operating in this country, and as you say, there's evidence of about 85, there may well be more. But what they do is they do not give Muslim women the equal rights as Muslim men. And often, for example, if a Muslim woman has got a divorce under British law, then the Sharia court may not grant that on their religious grounds, and therefore she is considered to still be married within that community. And they often pressurise the woman into staying in an abusive relationship. I mean, honestly, you know, some of the things that go on really need to be brought out in the open. And my overriding point is, look, we are, the United Kingdom has its system of law, it has common law. There is no room in this country for any parallel legal system.
And Sarah Pochin, the evidence seems to point towards the fact that, of course, Sharia courts are made up by panels of male Islamic scholars. There are no women who adjudicate on these so-called courts, and there is clear evidence that daughters can sometimes receive only half as much inheritance as sons. I thought the Labour Party stuck up for women's rights.
Well, exactly. But not only that, things like I say, it's very difficult for the woman to leave a relationship, even if it's abusive. If there's young children involved, then the woman will get custody, but only to a point at which the child is old enough to be taken away from its mother, and then custody is given to a guardian or the father. And you're right, you've raised the point of financial inequality. So this is absolutely the suppression of women's rights. And my point to the Justice Secretary is, when are we going to get a Justice Secretary in place that will ban this type of practice that we know is going on? There is no place for it in our society. And the other point I'd like to make is this does nothing for the integration of different cultures in our society. This is a very insular thing that is going on, a very insular operation that it's very difficult to get sight of, and it needs to be raised. And I think it was an entirely appropriate question with the new Secretary of State.
Sarah Pochin, you've asked the question, of course, at PMQs about the burqa ban. You've now asked a question about Sharia courts. Obviously, as you'd expect, people are saying, have you got a problem with the Muslim community? Are you Islamophobic?
There's nothing Islamophobic about me at all, but what I am doing is prioritising at every opportunity the British people, British law, British values, British culture. That is exactly what we should be doing, flying our British flag proudly at every opportunity. And what I'm doing is saying, anybody else that wants to come and live in our country, fine if you've got something to offer, but you live by our laws and you live under our culture.
Sarah Pochin, thanks for joining us as ever on GB News. A pleasure to have your company. Now let's get to my next guest. I'm joined by the senior litigation lawyer, Martab Aziz. Welcome to the show, Martab. Pleasure to have your company. Aren't Sharia courts basic proof that we do have two-tier justice in this country, something the Prime Minister swears to stand against?
Thank you for having me on your show, Martin. Pleasure to be on here. I'm afraid Sarah paints a rather grim picture of Sharia courts. But what comes out of it is I don't think she researched it properly. There was an independent review back in 2018 which actually said that Sharia courts serve a very good purpose, and particularly for women, because the first Sharia court was actually established back in 1982. And that was because there were so many Muslim women who were saying that they found it difficult to get an Islamic divorce because the husband was very difficult to pin down. So the procedures at that point were able to actually enable these very women to get what they wanted and get divorced. Now, in terms of the actual word Sharia court, they're not actually courts. They are actually a means or a process of mediation. Mediation is something which you try and do before going to court. So in terms of whether these are laws or courts that are impinging or trying to overturn or overtake the British law, it's absolute nonsense. It's not the case.
Hang on. What about the allegation, Mr. Aziz, that was just made there? Why do we need Sharia courts if we want to have integration in the United Kingdom? There is only one rule of law, and that is the British rule of law.
Right. Well, first of all, as you may know, jubilate as being severely restrictive in family law cases. So one thing is affordability. Secondly, why shouldn't people, if they're no one's forcing anyone to go to Sharia mediation tribunals. No one is forcing it. It's entirely voluntary. So, and the reason for it is because it's quick, it's cheap, and often it gets the right result.
OK, thank you very much for joining us. We'll leave it there. That's the senior litigation lawyer, Martab Aziz. Thank you very much. Now, coming up next is State of the Nation tonight with Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. Of course, Sir Jacob, you're listening intently there. What's your take on Sharia court laws and courts? Do we need to get rid of them?
There is one fundamental question, and that is it really a court or is it arbitration? In 1269, one of our most important constitutional laws was passed that said that justice could only be done in the King's Court. It's the Statute of Marlborough. And I think that's still relevant. You can have any arbitration you like. That's fine. But if it's a decision that you feel bound by, that must be done by the King's Courts. And so do the participants in Sharia law feel bound by the King's Courts? Catholic Church, if you want an annulment, Catholic Church does not recognise divorce, will only give you one after you've been through the legal procedure for divorce in this country. Likewise, the Catholic Church will only marry you if you've also got a civil marriage taking place. They are clearly after the fact of the King's laws. Is Sharia law in that category? And I'm afraid I think it probably isn't. I think that people in communities where they don't speak English as a first language, particularly women, feel that these are decisions rather than arbitrations, and that's where people need protection.
And many would say this is proof of two-tier justice. There should only be one rule of law